In the Blender basics, we touched on the topic of normals and how they're the direction that our mesh components are facing. This is incredibly important when it comes to shading as well as modeling. For shading, it's used in the calculation that determines what angle the light is hitting it at, which makes it look shaded correctly on our screen. For modeling, it allows us to do some really helpful operations like extrude along the normals, and get an even thickness all the way across a complex surface, which would otherwise be pretty difficult. When our object is set to flat shading in object mode, then each part of the surface of the face is going to have the exact same normal, which is what gives us this very faceted look. However, if we right-click in Shade Smooth, then the normal of each part of the face that's sampled is blended smoothly with the surrounding faces. This gives us a great-looking smooth result in areas where there's not a lot of change between the faces, but in areas where there's an extreme change, then it can look a little bit wrong. For example, with these areas that are inset into the model, we have this really sharp, almost 90-degree angle. And we see the shading blend across the entirety of those two faces, which results in a mushy, not very defined look. So it's often really helpful to tell Blender which sides of the faces should not be blended between, which we can do by marking sharp edges. So I'll go to Edge Select mode here, and I'll select this loop that goes all the way around that part of the cut, and then I'll right-click and choose Mark Sharp. Now one side of the edge isn't blended with the other, and we get a much nicer result in this case. So we could go through and start marking our edges as sharp all the way along the model here by going to the Edge menu, or if you're in Edge Select mode, the right-click Context menu. I can also use the hotkey Control-E in any other selection mode, and choose Mark Sharp. We could do this around the entire model, but of course that's going to be fairly time-consuming. We could go in and do a lot of our work automatically by going to Select, Sharp Edges, and selecting everything that's greater than, let's say, 35 degrees, and then Control-E and Mark Sharp, just like so. Or we could also do this same thing non-destructively as a modifier. So I'll go ahead and Control-Z to undo that, while still leaving a couple of our custom sharp edges, just as an example. And then let's go to our modifiers, Add Modifier, Normals, and Smooth by Angle. Now it'll do that marking sharp for us based on this adjustable angle. If you lower this too far down though, it'll start to mark edges that we don't necessarily want to be sharp. So usually the best thing for complex models is to set this high enough that it doesn't mark anything that you don't want to be sharp, like let's say 35 degrees here, and then go in and add some custom sharp edges, like I might want to do here. And that combination of custom edges and automatically applied edges usually makes for the fastest but also the most flexible workflow. You can also add this modifier extremely quickly in Blender 4.2 or later just by right-clicking in Object Mode and choosing Shade Auto Smooth. This will also pin the modifier to the bottom of the stack, so if you add any other modifiers, then it'll still be applied last. If you toggle on and off Ignore Sharpness, then you'll see the difference that our custom sharp edges make. One thing to know about custom normals and sharp edges, though, is that there can be a pretty significant performance impact from using them. Now, with a low poly object like this, then basically any PC or even a cheap laptop shouldn't break a sweat. But when you have extremely dense meshes, calculating the angle of every single edge can definitely add a lot of overhead, especially if the mesh is changing every single frame, like in an animation. That's why setting custom normals in edit mode is always going to be a little bit more performant than using the modifier, because it's not going to have to update every single frame if this mesh is deformed during animation. But even without that deformation, it still makes the mesh data itself a little bit more complicated. So if you're working on an animation in Blender's viewport and you don't care about it looking pretty as you're working, then what you can do is go to the Render tab, over to Simplify, and if you turn that on, you can go to Viewport and turn on Normals. That's going to disable custom normals and disable those sharp edges, and in some cases, this can double your frame rate or more during animation. But if you're just modeling and you're not animating, then that's probably not something you'll ever have to worry about. One thing we talked about with normals in the Blender basics is flipped normals and the importance of fixing them. So for an example, let's create a circle mesh here. I'll set the fill type to N-gon over in the redo panel in the bottom left, and then I'll tab into edit mode. Let's pretend that I wanted to make a cylinder, so I'll hit Shift D and duplicate this up, and I'll bridge between these two faces. So I'll select both of those, then I'll right-click and choose Bridge Faces. It might look like everything worked out pretty well, but if we investigate our normals, we'll see that this bottom one is facing in the wrong direction. We can also see that if we go over to our regular overlays and turn on face orientation. And here, red signifies that we're looking at the back of the face. We can also turn off face orientation and go to our shading popover and turn on back face culling if we want to look right through the back of the face like we would in a lot of game engines. When everything is shaded in solid view though, this isn't super obvious that it's causing problems. But if we were to continue working on our mesh, let's just say I take this bottom part and I'll hit Ctrl B to bevel, suddenly this isn't working as expected at all. Its behavior is super confusing. Or if we were to right click and shade smooth, then something is obviously wrong here. So the first thing, if tools aren't behaving as expected or the shading looks wrong, the first thing to always try is to select everything with A, and then go to Mesh, Normals, and choose Recalculate Outside or use the hotkey Shift-N. Once you do that, that should fix it automatically. But in case that it doesn't, you can also flip things manually by going to Face Select Mode and selecting some faces, using the hotkey Alt-N to bring up the Normals menu, and you can choose Flip. Here we can see some problems that that's causing. And if we were to, let's say, do an extrusion on an area here, we'd get some very weird results. So if we want to fix this manually, we could just select these faces. Again, Alt-N to bring up the Normals menu, and choose Flip. As we already talked about though, the shading on this cylinder looks pretty bad. And that's because blending between this face and that one is very extreme. And we just need more faces to blend between. But even if we were to bevel this, I'll go into edit mode and select the top and bottom face, Ctrl B to bevel, and I'll just give it one cut in between, something like that. Then this looks significantly better. But you'll also notice that the top isn't exactly flat, and this side does look like it's bulging out just a little bit. Now it might seem like I'm being extremely picky at this point, and I kind of am, but when it comes to more complex objects, this sort of difference can be a big deal. For example, if I take this top face here, and let's just say that I inset it, something like that, it almost looks like there's a divot here at this top face, even though it's completely flat. Of course, we could just add more geometry to it, but sometimes that's not an option. So another helpful modifier to know about is the weighted normal modifier. Let's go to our modifiers, down to normals, and let's choose weighted normal. What this modifier essentially does is shift that blending over into the smaller faces and leaves the larger faces as more flat. So we can see the before and after. And this definitely makes a pretty good difference. Let's look at one more example. I'll just hit Shift-A and add a cube, go into edit mode and select an edge, and I'll just give this a little bit of an angle here, just like so. And then let's inset one of these faces. I to inset, E to extrude along the Y, and just make some sort of random detail like this. Well, if I then take this entire mesh and Ctrl B to bevel, I'll just do something like that, just a little bit. Tab, go into object mode, right click and shade smooth. Then you can see that we get all sorts of artifacts here on the corner, and you can see that things just aren't looking flat, even though they should be. So let's add our weighted normal modifier, and that's improved things significantly. Now it's also flattened out some of these corners, so there are some ups and downs, but you can adjust the weight here and see how much influence works best for you. Just be sure that if you have some sharp edges, like for example, I'll mark some of these here, that you turn on Keep Sharp over in the modifier, so it doesn't overwrite those. And with that, we've covered pretty much everything you need to know about how to make the shading on your hard surface models look amazing.